Senator Xenophon.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. I wish to make some brief contributions in relation to this important bill. It is important because it deals with a number of issues that I believe some are good, particularly the family-friendly provisions, but I think others may actually be a job killer, and that worries me. I'll confine my remarks to a couple of areas, and I think it's worth reflecting on the contribution made by Professor Andrew Stewart, who's someone I have a great regard for. He's one of the academics who helped draft and develop the Fair Work Act. And just a couple of weeks ago, 2 weeks ago today, he was reported in the Australian as stating that the nation's workplace tribunal, the Fair Work Tribunal, risks being swamped by the new bullying regime, and that the ALP should have backed elements of the coalition's proposed changes. Professor Stewart, Andrew Stewart, for those that know him or know of him, is a well-known commentator on these issues. He did actually work with the government to help draft these changes, to draft the Fair Work Act. Not these changes, but the Fair Work Act generally. In other words, he was part of some of the leading academics, the leading thinkers in this field that were involved in scrapping work choices. He cannot be accused of being a friend of the coalition in relation to these matters, but I think it is fair to say that he is someone that has worked cooperatively and well with former Deputy Prime Minister and Prime Minister Gillard when she had the carriage of these matters. He has warned the government. He has accused the government of using a sledgehammer to crack a nut in terms of unions having a greater ability to recruit non-unionists in workplaces. He has said that the evidence given by the Commission's General Manager, Bernadette O'Neill, to a Senate estimates hearing recently, that the Commission expected to receive 3,500 bullying complaints a year, almost 10% of the total annual matters currently dealt with by the tribunal, and he was concerned that the Commission would be swamped by the workload. He said, and I quote, "I think there is a real risk that will happen," Professor Stewart said to Ewan Hannon, the industrial editor of The Australian. He went on to say, "If you look at the numbers the Commission has said it is planning on, now that's a huge number as it is. It's very, very difficult to know what people will do. I certainly think it would have been more sensible to build in some form of filtering mechanism to deal with bullying complaints." He also made the point in relation to the right of entry proposal, which will allow unions to meet employees in their lunchroom during breaks, has been sought by unions but opposed by the coalition business groups, and Professor Stewart thought the amendment was unnecessary as the Commission already had the power to deal with disputes about what meetings were held in workplaces. And I quote, "It's a sledgehammer to crack a nut," said Professor Stewart. "The number of workplaces where there is a dispute about union rights of entry are incredibly small, and the Commission has got the power to deal with those. There are going to be a lot of workplaces," Professor Stewart goes on, "where it is not obvious where the lunchroom is. I think in the end, rather than coming up with a sensible compromise, we have ended up through political posturing and unpredictable shifts in views from the independents with something less than optimal." And can I just say, Madam Acting Deputy President, I was not one of the independents that Professor Stewart was referring to. This is bad news for our workplaces. I want to make this clear. I am not anti-union. When I was a member of the South Australian Legislative Council, I introduced legislation ahead of the government in terms of right of entry provisions for union officials with respect to occupational health and safety, because I'm passionate that when people go to work, they should be able to come home, go to their work and go home to their families, their loved ones safely. And I have dealt with many, many people who have lost loved ones as a result of horrific industrial accidents, and I pay credit to Andrea Madeley, a courageous woman who lost her son Danny, her 18-year-old boy Danny, a number of years ago in a horrific industrial accident. And she and Andrea Madeley has established Void, the Voice of Industrial Death, which has been a great advocacy service for reform, a great advocacy and support service for all those who have lost loved ones through industrial accidents. So I do believe that there are circumstances where right of entry for unions, where the regulatory framework is broken down, where there aren't enough inspectors, where there is a safety valve, in a sense, for unions to have in terms of right of entry. And that is something that really that I maintain is appropriate. But I also think that we need to look at this legislation and heed the warnings of Professor Andrew Stewart, a man who I believe is very reasonable, is sensible in his approach, and by any measure cannot be considered a friend of the coalition on these matters. I also want to reflect on the issue of penalty rates. Alone in this place, because the coalition doesn't share my views, I believe that something needs to be done about the small business sector, those genuinely small businesses with 20 full-time employees, full-time equivalent employees or less, because they have been hammered by penalty rates. The changes in penalty rates have actually led to a loss of thousands of jobs around the country. And I say that as a result of a comprehensive survey undertaken by Restaurant and Catering Australia, which indicates equivalent, this is over a year ago, equivalent to 3,000 full-time equivalent jobs have already been lost in the restaurant and catering sector. I speak to small retailers day in, day out, who tell me about how hard it is to survive with weekend penalty rates, how they have employees, particularly students, who are university students, who are prepared to work for a reasonable rate. We're not talking it below the award. We're even talking allowing for a casual loading on weekends. But they've cut back those hours, or they've actually shut down entirely on Sundays because the penalty rates have been simply too punitive. And that is something that we need to consider. My concern is that this bill will make it even less flexible. This bill will actually be a job killer in some sectors. And I think it's worth reflecting on what was said in a recent in a Sydney Morning Herald editorial on the 11th of February of this year. I don't think anyone can accuse the Sydney Morning Herald of pursuing through its editorials a right-wing agenda in terms of industrial relations. But they said this about the whole issue of penalty rates. Economic growth without a significant population increase requires a flexible workforce to be paid fair and affordable wages. When laws prevent this and impose outdated standards to the detriment of job creation and higher incomes for all, it is time for modernisation. I think it's also worth reflecting in terms of what Peter Strong said, the head of the Council of Small Business Organisations of Australia, the Council of Small Business. Peter Strong, for anyone that knows him, has been a fearless advocate for small business in this country. He's worked well with both the government and the opposition. He had a very good relationship with the Gillard government, with the Prime Minister, with the former Prime Minister herself, in terms of working for small businesses. No one can accuse Peter Strong of being some form of right-wing ideologue. But Peter Strong made this point in the submission to the bill that I put up on penalty rates. He says, in those small workplaces, as you know, if you sack someone because of penalty rates on a Sunday, then you have to look that person in the eye and say, I'm sorry, you have to go. It hurts you, it hurts them more, because that money is gone. But it hurts a small business owner because this is someone that who they have been working with, who they potentially value, who lives nearby and is part of their community. I just think we need to look at this in a sensible way. This is killing small businesses. It is denying many Australians, particularly young Australians, of job opportunities on weekends. And the coalition, I thought the coalition was the party for small businesses ostensibly, but you have abandoned small businesses by remaining silent on something that has actually hurt so many small businesses in this country. And I will not be accused, however, Madam Acting Deputy President, of being anti-union or anti-worker. I work with a number of unions on a whole range of issues. I have a very good and constructive relationship with Tony Sheldon, the head of the TWU, in terms of Qantas jobs that could potentially be lost because of the stupid and asinine and baffling management decisions made by Qantas. I work with the licensed aircraft engineers, with Steve Pavinas, the National Secretary of that union, in terms of jobs being offshored. I work with the CMFEU, with Michael O'Connor, another union leader who I have great regard for, on the issue of dumping in Australian jobs being lost because of unfair trade practices and the importance of making sure that we can compete fairly in the marketplace. So I will not be accused of being anti-union or anti-worker, but when young people come up to me and say they lost their shift on a Sunday that they were relying on to get through uni because the small business could not afford to stay open on the weekend, then there is something seriously wrong, and we need to heed what the Sydney Morning Herald said in relation to that. So, Madam Acting Deputy President, I think it's worth reflecting, and I would like to ask these questions of the government. The government is proposing to make the workplaces less flexible. And I should say that, to me, a template of good industrial relations policy was that during the Hawke-Keating era. I think they did a lot of good things. I thought that was a very good government. The Hawke and Keating governments did a lot of good things for the economy. They drove productivity, they drove equity and fairness in the workplace, and what we saw was a robust economy to a large degree for most of the time that they were there. And they actually set up some reforms in place that I think put the Australian economy in good stead. I am worried that what we see now is a less flexible workplace than under the Hawke-Keating era. I worry that we are actually denying many young Australians, particularly jobs. I'm worried that the unemployment rate, while nominally at 5.5%, does not in any way reflect the true unemployment rate in this nation, because we know that the Australian Bureau of Statistics measure of unemployment, which unfortunately is an internationally adopted measure, is a crock. Why? Because to be employed, you are considered to be employed so long as you are working 1 hour a week or more. So the level of underemployment is massive. The level of people that might have 1 or 2 or 3 hours a week, or 3 hours a week or so, is significant. That the real measure of unemployment is 12 to 15%, and I fear it will go much higher, much higher. So this is not about exploitation. It's just about some fairness and giving those small businesses that want to do the right thing by the community a real opportunity. I want to ask the government, in terms of the current provisions of the Fair Work Act. The Fair Work Act in Section 3 makes reference to the particular needs, and I don't have it immediately in front of me, but it makes maybe Senator Cash can. No, I have it. Senator Cash, who's an expert in these fields, could have assisted me. The objects of the Act include, under Part G, subsection G, acknowledging the special circumstances of small and medium-sized business. However, this bill that we see before us, that has gone through a flawed process, that has been criticised by friends of the Fair Work Act, such as Professor Andrew Stewart, actually says that the Fair Work Commission, ensuring that modern awards provide fair and relevant minimum conditions, must take into account the need to provide additional remuneration for overtime, unsocial, irregular and unpredictable hours, work on weekends or public holidays and shift work. What about those workers, those students, who the only day that they can practically work because of their study commitments, Sunday, the weekend, is the best time for them? What about those people who, because of their family arrangements, prefer to work after hours in those circumstances? And we're talking about people working well under 38 hours a week for that casual work. I want to know from the government, on notice because of this process where the debate will be guillotined, I want to know how will Part G, 3G of the Act, in relation to the particular needs of small and medium businesses, be considered in the context of these proposed amendments. Will it nullify Part 3G? How will it be dealt with? How will it be considered in a way that is fair and equitable? Can I indicate, Madam Acting Deputy President, because there are a number of other speakers, that I've got reservations about a number of the amendments in this bill. I think the process has been flawed. I want to acknowledge the important work that the union movement does for the welfare of workers in this nation, and the work of the unionists that I have a bit to do with Michael O'Connor from the CMFEU, from Tony Sheldon from the TWU, of Steve Pavinas from the Licensed Aircraft Engineers. And I make it clear that none of them agree with me on my penalty rates provision, but I don't think that my penalty rates proposals would not in any way impact on their sectors by and large, because it's about small business in just the hospitality and the retailing sector, the two most vulnerable sectors in respect of penalty rates. I want to make the point that unions play an integral part, a vital part in our economy. I agree with people such as Bill Kelty that we do need to look at another accord. We do need to look at getting business, large and small business this time as well, with unions and government, to sit down and work out how we can make our nation more productive, to the sort of thing that Martin Ferguson, who's made a valuable contribution in this place and in the union movement, has talked about if you want to get a bigger share of the pie, you need a bigger pie. We're going to shrink the pie with this piece of legislation unless it is amended in some meaningful way.
Thanks, Senator Xenophon.